Katie Morrison sat at her workstation and watched the aliens work around her like she was invisible. The navigation lab of the stellar horizon buzzed with activity as 12 different species worked together to map the unknown parts of space. Katie was the only human among them, and everyone treated her like she did not belong there. The ship was huge and filled with the smartest minds from across the galaxy. The Zephyrians looked like walking crystals that sparkled when they thought hard about math problems. The Thralax had 8 arms like octopuses and could move holographic displays with all of them at once. The Kyrithi looked like giant insects with eyes that could see patterns in data faster than any computer. Katie was 22 years old and fresh out of space school back on Earth. She got this job not because anyone thought she was special, but because the Galactic Confederation wanted to include humans in their big projects. Most aliens saw humans as the new kids in space who had barely learned to fly between stars, while other species had been exploring the galaxy for thousands of years. Commander Veltar led the navigation team, and his crystal body flashed different colors when he was thinking. He was a Zephyrian who could do math calculations in his head that would take human computers hours to finish. His second in command was Dr. Nexus from the Thralax homeworld. She could think in 3 dimensions better than anyone and move 8 different tools at the same time with her tentacle arms. The team also had Chitrix, who belonged to the Kyrithi species. Her compound eyes could look at thousands of pieces of information at once and find patterns that others missed completely. These 3 aliens ran the navigation department and made all the important decisions about where the ship would go and how they would map new areas of space. For 6 weeks, Katie had been doing the boring jobs that nobody else wanted to do. She organized files of star surveys that came back from robot probes. She cleaned up databases full of information about planets and space rocks. She made sure the backup computer systems were running properly and updated the software that kept track of supply deliveries. The senior officers talked around Katie like she was a piece of furniture. They discussed complicated theories about how to navigate through space using words she barely understood. When Katie tried to ask questions or make suggestions, they would smile politely and then ignore everything she said. Sometimes they would explain basic concepts to her like she was a child learning about space for the first time. The big project everyone was working on involved mapping something called the void sector. This was a strange part of space where survey ships kept having problems with their navigation equipment and sensors. Several robot probes had been sent into the area over the past few months, but they all sent back confusing information before losing contact with the main ship. Previous teams had tried to make maps of the void sector, but they always failed. The information they collected had big gaps and contradictions that made no sense. Ships would enter the area following what should have been safe routes, but then get lost or have their equipment stop working properly. Katie listened carefully to everything the aliens discussed during their team meetings. She noticed that Commander Veltar made very precise mathematical calculations, but seemed to miss some of the smaller details that might be important. Dr. Nexus was brilliant at understanding how objects move through 3-dimensional space, but she had trouble with some of the quantum physics concepts that affected very small particles. Chitrix could spot patterns in data faster than anyone Katie had ever seen, but only when those patterns fit into categories she already knew about. If something was completely new or different from what she expected, the Kyrithi scientist would sometimes miss it entirely. During meetings, Katie tried several times to point out things she had noticed in the failed mapping data. She saw connections between different types of sensor readings that might explain why the probes were having problems. But every time she started to speak up, one of the senior officers would interrupt her or change the subject to something else. The aliens were not mean to Katie, but they clearly did not think she had anything useful to contribute to their work. They had been exploring space since before humans discovered fire, and their technology was thousands of years more advanced than anything Earth had ever built. From their point of view, Katie was like a kindergarten student trying to help university professors solve advanced physics problems. Katie began staying late in the navigation lab after her official work hours ended. She told everyone she was catching up on filing and data organization, but Really, she was studying all the information about the void sector that the team had collected. She read through probe reports and sensor logs and mathematical models that previous expeditions had created. The more Katie studied the data, the more she became convinced that the alien scientists were missing something important about the void sector. Each species was very good at their particular type of thinking, but they all had blind spots where their natural abilities did not work well. The Zephyrians were amazing at pure mathematics, but they thought in very rigid logical steps. The Thralax understood space and movement perfectly, but they came from ocean worlds where everything flowed smoothly. The Karathi could find any pattern that existed within normal categories but struggled when something was completely outside their experience. 3 months into the mission, the team faced their biggest challenge yet. 3 more robot probes had disappeared in the void sector, and the partial data they sent back before losing contact made even less sense than previous reports. The readings showed impossible things like gravity pointing in multiple directions at once in time, moving at different speeds in different locations. Katie studied this new data late into the night while the rest of the crew slept. She spread printouts across her small desk and drew connections between different readings with colored pens. Something about the void sector reminded her of weather patterns back on Earth, but she could not quite figure out what the connection meant. The pressure was building on Commander Veltar and his team to solve the mapping problem. The Galactic Confederation had spent enormous amounts of money and resources on this mission. If they failed to map the void sector, it would set back deep space exploration for decades and make the aliens question whether humans deserved to be included in future projects. Katie knew that if she was going to help solve this problem, she would need to find undeniable proof that her ideas were correct. The senior officers had shown no interest in listening to her suggestions so far, and she could not afford to be wrong if she ever got the chance to speak up. The weeks passed, and the pressure aboard the Stellar Horizon grew heavier each day. Commander Veltar called more meetings, and his crystal body flickered with stress colors that Katie had never seen before. The Galactic Confederation kept sending messages asking for progress reports, and everyone knew that time was running out to solve the void sector mystery. Katie continued doing her assigned work during the day, but she spent every free moment studying the mapping problem in secret. She developed a routine of staying in the navigation lab long after the senior officers had gone to their quarters for sleep. The official reason was that she needed extra time to finish organizing data files, but the real reason was much different. When the lab was empty and quiet, Katie could spread out all the probe reports and sensor readings without anyone asking what she was doing. She printed copies of the most important data and kept them in a private folder that she carried everywhere. During meal breaks and rest periods, she would review the information and make notes in her personal data pad. The more Katie studied the different alien species, the more she understood why they were struggling with the void sector problem. Each group was incredibly smart at their specialty, but they all thought about problems in very specific ways that matched how their brains had evolved on their home planets. The Zephyrians came from a world of crystal formations where mathematics and logic ruled everything. Their minds worked like living computers that could solve equations perfectly, but had trouble with concepts that required creative thinking or intuitive leaps. They approached every problem by breaking it down into numbers and formulas. The Thralax evolved in deep oceans where everything moved in smooth flowing patterns. They were brilliant at understanding how objects moved through three-dimensional space and could visualize complex geometric relationships better than any other species. But they struggled with sudden changes or discrete quantum effects that did not follow smooth continuous patterns. The Karathi came from a world where survival depended on quickly recognizing patterns that indicated danger or opportunity. Their compound eyes and hive mind heritage made them incredibly fast at spotting familiar patterns in large amounts of data. However, this same ability made it hard for them to recognize patterns that were completely outside their previous experience. Katie realized that the void sector mapping problem required a type of thinking that combined all these different approaches. The region seemed to follow mathematical rules like the Zephyrians preferred, but those rules changed in flowing ways that the Thralax might understand. At the same time, the overall behavior created patterns that were unlike anything the Kyrathi had seen before. During team meetings, Katie watched the senior officers argue about different approaches to the problem. Commander Veltar wanted to create more precise mathematical models of the sector. Dr. Nexus insisted they needed better three-dimensional mapping techniques. Chitrix kept trying to find patterns in the probe data that matched successful navigation. From other difficult regions, none of them seemed willing to consider that their individual approaches might be incomplete. Each species was so confident in their particular type of intelligence that they could not imagine needing help from the others. The arguments became more heated as the mission deadline approached, and still no progress was made. Katie began making detailed notes about what she observed during these meetings. She wrote down every theory and approach that the aliens tried. She recorded which methods failed and why they might have failed. Most importantly, she started developing her own ideas about what was really happening in the void sector. Her human brain had evolved on a planet where survival required adapting to many different environments and situations. Humans had to deal with forests and deserts and oceans and mountains all on the same world. They had to recognize patterns in weather and animal behavior and plant growth that could change rapidly and unpredictably. This evolutionary background gave Katie a different way of thinking about complex problems. Instead of focusing on one type of analysis like the alien specialists, she naturally tried to combine multiple approaches. She looked for connections between different types of data that the others were studying separately. Late one night while reviewing probe telemetry, Katie had a breakthrough. She noticed that the sensor failures in the void sector happened in sequences that reminded her of storm systems on Earth. The readings would start normal, then gradually become chaotic, then suddenly return to normal in a pattern that repeated, with slight variations. Katie spent the next several nights testing this theory against all the available data. She found that if she treated the void sector like a weather system instead of a static region of space, many of the confusing readings began to make sense. The probe failures were not random equipment malfunctions, but predictable responses to conditions that changed over time. This insight led Katie to an even bigger realization. The void sector was not just a difficult region to navigate through. It was a region where space and time themselves behaved differently than in normal areas. The mathematical rules that worked everywhere else in the galaxy were different there, but not random or chaotic. Katie began developing her own mapping methodology based on this new understanding. Instead of trying to create a static map like previous expeditions, she designed a dynamic system that could account for changes over time. Her approach treated the void sector as a living system that followed its own internal patterns. The work was incredibly difficult, and Katie had to teach herself advanced physics concepts that were not covered in her basic training. She used the ship's computer systems to run simulations and test her theories, but she had to be careful not to leave traces that the senior officers might discover. Meanwhile, the team received more bad news about the void sector. 2 more survey ships had reported navigation problems while attempting to enter the region. One ship had to abort its mission completely when its sensors began giving readings that contradicted each other. The other ship made it deeper into the sector but had to turn back when crew members began experiencing disorientation and nausea. Commander Veltar called an emergency meeting to discuss these new developments. The crystal being's body flashed angry red colors as he announced that the Galactic Confederation was considering canceling the entire mapping project. Too many resources had been lost already, and the risk to crew members was becoming unacceptable. Dr. Nexus argued that they just needed more time to develop better shielding for their ships. Chitrix insisted that the pattern analysis was close to a breakthrough, and they should send more probes to gather additional data. But Katie could see that none of their approaches were addressing the real problem. During the meeting, Katie almost spoke up several times to share her weather system theory. Each time she started to raise her hand or open her mouth, she remembered how the senior officers had dismissed her previous attempts to contribute. She realized that even if her theory was correct, they would not listen to her without concrete proof. That night, Katie made a decision that would change everything. She would complete her dynamic mapping system and find a way to test it without the senior officers knowing. If her theory was right, she would have undeniable evidence that could save the mission. If she was wrong, she would quietly abandon the idea and nobody would ever know about her failure. The next morning brought news that made Katie's secret project even more urgent. A manned exploration ship called the Deep Explorer had entered the void sector despite the navigation warnings. The ship was carrying a crew of 15 researchers from 6 different species, who were trying to collect samples from the mysterious region. The Deep Explorer had been out of contact for 12 hours and search teams were preparing to launch a rescue mission. But without accurate maps of the void sector, the rescue ships would face the same dangers that had probably trapped the original expedition. Katie knew that lives were now at stake and her private research project had suddenly become a matter of life and death. The news about the Deep Explorer changed everything aboard the Stellar Horizon. Katie watched Commander Veltar pace back and forth in the navigation lab while his crystal body flashed urgent orange and red patterns. Dr. Nexus had all 8 of her tentacle arms working at different control panels trying to establish contact with the missing ship. Chitrix was analyzing every piece of data they had about the void sector with her compound eyes, moving so fast they looked like they were vibrating. The Galactic Confederation had given the team 48 hours to develop a rescue plan. If they could not locate the Deep Explorer and guide rescue ships safely through the void sector, then 15 lives would be lost and the mapping project would be permanently canceled. The pressure on the senior officers was enormous and Katie could see the stress affecting everyone. Katie knew that the conventional approaches being used by the alien specialists would not work. She had spent weeks studying their methods and had seen how each species got stuck thinking about the problem in only one way. The void sector required a completely different approach that none of them were willing to consider for the first time. Since joining the mission, Katie felt truly motivated to share her ideas. Lives were at stake now, and she could not stay quiet just because the senior officers had ignored her in the past. But she also knew that trying to convince them during a crisis would be almost impossible. They were too focused on their own expertise to listen to suggestions from someone they considered unqualified. Katie decided to work through the night to complete her dynamic mapping system. If she could create a working model that accurately predicted the void sector behavior, then she would have proof that could not be ignored. She gathered all her research materials and settled into her workstation for what would be the most important night of her career, the key insight that had led Katie to her breakthrough was treating the void sector like a weather system instead of a static region of space. On Earth, weather patterns followed complex rules that combined many different factors, including temperature and pressure and humidity and wind currents. The patterns were predictable, but only if you understood all the variables and how they interacted with each other. The void sector seemed to work the same way, but with space and time instead of air and water. The region existed in a state of quantum flux where the normal rules of physics were bent but not broken. Space could stretch and compress like elastic material, while time could speed up or slow down depending on local conditions. Katie realized that the failed mapping attempts were happening because everyone was trying to create charts that assumed space and time were constant throughout the region. This was like trying to map ocean currents without accounting for tides and storms and underwater mountains. The maps were useless because they did not reflect the reality of how the environment actually behaved. Her new approach treated the void sector as a 4-dimensional system where position and time were connected in ways that did not happen in normal space. Navigation through the region required tracking not just where you were, but when you were and how both factors were changing as you moved. The mathematics involved were incredibly complex, and Katie had to use every physics concept she had learned in school, plus many more that she taught herself from the ship's computer databases. She created algorithms that could predict how space-time distortions would affect ship navigation based on quantum field fluctuations and gravitational anomalies. Working through the night, Katie built a complete simulation of the void sector using her weather system model. She input all the data from failed probe missions and previous mapping attempts to test whether her system could have predicted the problems that occurred. To her amazement, the simulation accurately showed why each probe had failed and where the navigation errors had happened. The breakthrough moment came when Katie realized that the void sector distortions followed cycles, like seasonal weather patterns on planets. The quantum storms that disrupted navigation equipment happened on a regular schedule that could be predicted if you knew what to look for. Ships could navigate safely through the region by timing their movements to avoid the worst distortions. Katie's simulation showed that the Deep Explorer had entered the void sector during the beginning of a major quantum storm cycle. The ship was probably trapped in a temporal eddy where time was moving much slower than in normal space. The crew might think they had only been missing for a few hours, while actually days had passed in the outside universe. This discovery was both encouraging and terrifying. The Deep Explorer crew was probably still alive, but they were running out of time as the quantum storm intensified. A rescue mission would need to navigate through increasingly dangerous distortions to reach them. Before their life support systems failed. Katie spent the remaining hours before dawn refining her navigation algorithms and creating detailed route maps for the rescue mission. Her system could identify safe corridors through the quantum storms that would allow ships to reach the Deep Explorer location. The routes changed over time as the storm patterns shifted, but they were predictable if you used the right mathematical models. As morning approached, Katie faced the same problem that had frustrated her throughout the mission. She had developed a solution that could save lives, but she had no way to convince the senior officers to listen to her. They were under tremendous pressure and had no reason to trust theories from someone they considered inexperienced. Katie decided on a different approach. Instead of trying to present her findings directly to the senior staff, she would quietly implement her navigation corrections in the ship's computer systems. The backup navigation protocols that she maintained as part of her regular duties could be modified to include her quantum storm predictions. She spent the early morning hours carefully embedding her navigation algorithms into the backup systems. To anyone checking, the modifications would look like routine calibration updates and drift corrections rather than a complete reimagining of how to navigate the void sector. Katie made sure that her changes would only activate when the conventional navigation systems encountered problems. The plan was risky because if her theories were wrong, the rescue mission could be sent off course or encounter even more dangerous conditions. But Katie was confident in her analysis, and she knew that the conventional approaches had already proven ineffective. The rescue ships needed better navigation data, and her weather system model was the only thing that made sense of the void sector anomalies. Katie finished her modifications just as the day shift began arriving in the navigation lab. She quickly cleared her workstation of research materials and returned to her normal duties of organizing files and maintaining databases. To anyone watching, she appeared to be doing the same boring tasks that had occupied her time since the mission began. Commander Veltar called a briefing for all senior staff to finalize the rescue mission plans. Katie listened from her workstation as the alien officers discussed their approach to navigating the void sector. They were planning to use enhanced sensor arrays and improved mathematical models to avoid the problems that had affected previous expeditions. Katie knew their plans would fail because they were still treating the void sector as a static region instead of a dynamic system. But she said nothing and continued working at her computer terminal while the most important rescue mission in galactic history was being planned around theories that she knew were incomplete. The briefing ended with the decision to launch the rescue fleet in 6 hours. 3 ships would enter the void sector using the best navigation data that Commander Veltar and his team could provide. Katie watched the senior officers leave the lab to make final preparations while she quietly activated the backup navigation protocols that contained her hidden modifications. In a few hours, the rescue ships would discover whether a young human who had been ignored and overlooked throughout the mission, had found the key to safely navigating one of the most dangerous regions in known space. The rescue fleet launched exactly on schedule, with 3 ships heading into the void sector using navigation plans developed by the senior alien specialists. Katie sat at her workstation monitoring the mission through her computer terminal while trying to look like she was doing routine file maintenance. Her heart pounded as she watched the ships approach the boundary of the dangerous region where so many previous expeditions had failed. The lead rescue ship was commanded by Captain Brooks from Earth, along with a mixed crew of humans and aliens. The second ship carried a team of Zephyrian engineers led by Commander Veltar himself, who wanted to personally oversee the rescue operation. The third ship was staffed entirely by Thralax, specialists with their superior spatial reasoning abilities and advanced sensor equipment. Katie had embedded her navigation corrections deep in the backup systems of all 3 ships during routine maintenance updates over the past few weeks. The modifications were designed to activate automatically when the conventional navigation systems encountered the quantum anomalies that made the void sector so dangerous. To the ship crews, her corrections would appear as normal system compensations, rather than a completely different approach to navigation. As the rescue fleet crossed into the void sector, Katie watched their telemetry feeds with growing tension. The first few minutes went smoothly as the ships followed their planned routes through what appeared to be normal space. But Katie knew from her analysis that they were approaching the edge of a major quantum storm system that would begin affecting their instruments within the hour. Commander Veltar was broadcasting regular status reports back to the stellar horizon from his position aboard the second rescue ship. His crystal body was flashing confident blue patterns as he described how their enhanced mathematical models were successfully guiding the fleet through the preliminary stages of the mission. Dr. Nexus was coordinating sensor sweeps from the navigation lab using data feeds from all 3 ships. Katie listened to these reports while secretly monitoring the backup navigation systems that contained her hidden modifications. The quantum storm was building strength exactly as her weather model had predicted, and within minutes the conventional navigation equipment would start giving contradictory readings that had confused every previous expedition. The crisis began when the lead ship reported that their primary navigation sensors were detecting impossible gravitational readings. Captain Brooks announced that his instruments showed gravity pointing in 3 different directions at the same time, while his ship's chronometer indicated that time was moving at variable speeds in different parts of the vessel. Commander Veltar immediately ordered all ships to halt their advance while the navigation team analyzed these anomalous readings. Katie watched Dr. Nexus manipulating holographic displays with all 8 of her tentacle arms as she tried to make sense of sensor data that contradicted everything the team thought they knew about physics. This was the moment Katie had been waiting for. As the conventional navigation system struggled with the impossible readings, her backup protocols automatically activated and began feeding corrected navigation data to the ship computers. The modifications appeared as routine calibration adjustments that compensated for local interference rather than fundamental changes to how navigation worked. The effect was immediate and dramatic. Captain Brooks reported that his navigation systems had suddenly stabilized and were now providing clear route guidance through what had moments before seemed like chaotic space. The gravitational readings still looked strange, but his computer was compensating for the anomalies and showing a safe path forward. Commander Veltar was amazed by the sudden improvement in navigation accuracy. His ship's instruments were now detecting stable corridors through the quantum distortions that had been invisible just minutes earlier. The mathematical models that had seemed inadequate were suddenly working perfectly, as if the void sector had become a normal region of space. Katie watched the mission progress while maintaining her routine duties and saying nothing about her role in the navigation improvements. She felt a mixture of excitement and terror as the rescue ships penetrated deeper into the void sector than any previous expedition had managed. Her theories were being tested under the most dangerous possible conditions with real lives at stake. The breakthrough came 2 hours into the mission when the rescue fleet successfully located the Deep Explorer trapped in what Katie's model had predicted would be a temporal eddy. The missing ship was caught in a region where time moved much slower than in normal space, causing the crew to experience only a few hours while several days had passed in the outside universe. Captain Brooks reported that the Deep Explorer appeared undamaged, but was completely unable to navigate out of the temporal distortion using conventional methods. The ship's crew had tried repeatedly to escape, but their navigation systems could not compensate for the time dilation effects that made normal space seem to twist and bend around them. Katie's navigation algorithms had predicted this exact situation and had already calculated the precise route needed to extract the trapped ship from the temporal eddy. The rescue fleet received automated guidance updates that showed them how to approach the Deep Explorer and establish a tractor beam connection without becoming trapped in the same distortion. The rescue operation proceeded flawlessly as Katie's hidden navigation system guided all 4 ships safely out of the temporal eddy and back toward normal space. Commander Veltar was broadcasting excited reports about the unprecedented success of their enhanced navigation techniques while completely unaware that a human junior officer was responsible for the breakthrough. Dr. Nexus was equally amazed by the performance of navigation systems that seemed to have developed capabilities far beyond their original specifications. Her sensor arrays were detecting route optimizations and spatial corrections that should not have been possible with their current technology. The mathematics involved were more sophisticated than anything the senior staff had created. Katie remained quiet at her workstation as the most successful navigation mission in galactic history unfolded around her. She had solved a problem that had stumped the finest minds from 12 different species, but she felt no need to claim credit for her achievement. The satisfaction came from knowing that 15 lives had been saved and that her quiet contribution had made the impossible possible. The rescue fleet emerged from the void sector after 6 hours with all crew members safe and the Deep Explorer successfully recovered. It was the first time in galactic history that ships had navigated deep into the dangerous region and returned without losing contact or suffering equipment failures. Commander Veltar immediately ordered a comprehensive analysis of all navigation data from the mission. He wanted to understand how their systems had suddenly developed such remarkable capabilities and whether the improvements could be replicated for future expeditions. The crystal being was convinced that they had achieved a major breakthrough in spatial navigation theory. Katie listened to the senior officers discussing their plans to reverse engineer the navigation improvements, while she quietly deleted the temporary files she had used to monitor the mission. Her modifications were now permanently embedded in the ship's backup systems, where they would continue providing enhanced navigation capabilities without revealing their true origin. The successful rescue had proven that Katie's weather system approach to understanding the void sector was not only correct but also practical for real-world navigation. Her dynamic mapping algorithms had guided ships safely through quantum storms that had destroyed or disabled every previous expedition, but the most important test was still ahead. Katie knew that the senior officers would soon discover that their navigation systems contained modifications they had not authorized. The investigation that would follow would either lead to a recognition of her contribution or potentially serious consequences for unauthorized changes to critical ship systems. Katie spent the evening cleaning up the last traces of her research while the rest of the crew celebrated the successful rescue mission. Tomorrow would bring questions about how the navigation breakthrough had been achieved, and Katie would finally have to decide whether to reveal her role in solving the greatest mapping challenge in galactic history. The morning after the successful rescue mission brought a flurry of activity to the navigation lab as Commander Veltar and his team began their investigation into how their systems had suddenly developed unprecedented capabilities. Katie arrived at her workstation early and watched the senior officers analyze data from the Void Sector expedition with intense concentration. Commander Veltar's crystal body flickered through rapid color changes as he reviewed the navigation logs from all 3 rescue ships. The mathematical models that had guided the mission were far more sophisticated than anything his team had created, yet they had somehow emerged from their existing computer systems during the crisis. Dr. Nexus was using all 8 of her tentacle arms to manipulate holographic displays showing the successful route through the void sector. Her spatial reasoning abilities allowed her to visualize the path the ships had taken, but she could not understand how their navigation computers had calculated such an elegant solution to the quantum storm problem. Chitrix was applying her pattern recognition skills to analyze every piece of telemetry data from the rescue mission. Her compound eyes processed thousands of data points simultaneously as she searched for clues about how the navigation breakthrough had been achieved. The patterns she found were unlike anything in her vast database of previous expeditions. Katie continued her normal duties of organizing files and maintaining backup systems while secretly listening to every word of the investigation. She knew it was only a matter of time before the trail led back to her workstation and the modifications she had embedded in the ship's computer network. The breakthrough in the investigation came when Dr. Nexus decided to trace the origin of the navigation improvements through the ship's computer architecture. Her analysis revealed that the enhanced algorithms had emerged from the backup navigation protocols rather than the primary systems that the senior staff had been working on. Commander Veltar was surprised by this discovery because the backup systems were maintained by junior personnel rather than the specialized navigation team. He ordered a complete audit of all recent modifications to determine who had access to those particular computer networks and when the changes had been implemented. Katie felt her stomach tighten as she realized the investigation was closing in on her unauthorized modifications. She had been careful to make the changes look like routine maintenance, but a thorough analysis would eventually reveal that someone had embedded completely new algorithms in the backup navigation protocols. The audit results came back within hours and showed that Katie Morrison was the only person who had made significant modifications to the backup navigation systems during the weeks leading up to the rescue mission. Her access logs indicated that she had been working on those systems during off-duty hours when the senior staff assumed she was catching up on filing tasks. Commander Veltar called Katie to his office that afternoon for what he described as a routine interview about her maintenance work on the backup systems. Katie knew this was the moment when her secret contribution to the mission would either be recognized or result in serious disciplinary action for unauthorized modifications to critical ship systems. Katie entered the commander's office to find all 3 senior officers waiting for her along with holographic displays showing her navigation algorithms and modification logs. Commander Veltar's crystal body was flashing neutral yellow patterns that gave no indication of his mood or intentions. Dr. Nexus spoke first and asked Katie to explain the modifications she had made to the backup navigation protocols over the past several weeks. Katie took a deep breath and decided to tell the complete truth about her analysis of the void sector and the weather system model she had developed to understand the quantum storm patterns. Katie explained how she had noticed that each alien species approached the mapping problem using only their particular cognitive strengths while missing connections that required a more holistic perspective. She described her insight that the void sector behaved like a weather system rather than a static region of space, and how this realization had led to her dynamic mapping algorithms. Commander Veltar listened in silence as Katie walked through her analysis step by step. She showed them how she had identified the cyclical patterns in the quantum storms and developed mathematical models that could predict safe navigation corridors through the temporal distortions. Chitrix was the first to respond and admitted that Katie's pattern recognition had identified connections that her own specialized analysis had completely missed. The human approach of looking for similarities to Earth weather systems was so far outside Karathi's experience that it had never occurred to her to consider such analogies. Dr. Nexus was amazed by Katie's ability to synthesize spatial navigation concepts with temporal mechanics in ways that her 3-dimensional thinking had not been able to achieve. The Thralax scientist realized that Katie's 4-dimensional approach to the problem had been exactly what was needed to understand the void sector anomalies. Commander Veltar was perhaps the most surprised of all because Katie's mathematical models were not only correct, but more elegant than anything his team had developed using conventional approaches. The human had somehow intuited solutions to quantum physics problems that should have required years of specialized study to understand. The three senior officers spent the next several hours questioning Katie about every aspect of her analysis and navigation algorithms. They tested her theories against historical data from failed expeditions and found that her weather system model accurately predicted every known navigation failure in the void sector. Katie answered their questions with the same quiet competence she had shown throughout the mission. She was not defensive about working without authorization, but simply explained that she had not believed anyone would listen to theories from someone they considered unqualified to contribute to advanced navigation research. Commander Veltar admitted that Katie was correct about the team's attitude toward human capabilities. The senior staff had assumed that a species so new to space travel could not contribute meaningful insights to problems that had challenged galactic civilization for decades. The investigation concluded with a complete vindication of Katie's approach and formal recognition that her unauthorized modifications had saved 15 lives and solved the greatest mapping challenge in recent galactic history. Commander Veltar recommended Katie for immediate promotion to Senior Navigation Specialist with full authority to implement her dynamic mapping protocols. DR Nexus proposed that Katie's weather system model be adopted as the standard approach for analyzing regions of space with unusual quantum properties. Her holistic methodology could potentially solve navigation problems in dozens of other dangerous sectors that had been considered impossible to map. Chitrick suggested that the Galactic Confederation establish new protocols that actively sought out diverse perspectives when tackling complex scientific problems. The rescue mission had proven that cognitive diversity was just as important as technological advancement in pushing the boundaries of space exploration. The formal announcement of Katie's promotion came 3 days later, along with news that the Stellar Horizon would be leading a new deep space mapping initiative based on her navigation innovations. The mission would include representatives from every member species of the Galactic Confederation, but with explicit requirements for collaborative problem-solving approaches. Katie found herself assigned to design training programs that would teach alien specialists how to incorporate human-style holistic thinking into their specialized analysis methods. Her quiet revolution in navigation theory had sparked a broader recognition that the galaxy's most challenging problems might require combinations of different types of intelligence. The story concluded with Katie leading her first briefing as Senior Navigation Specialist to a room full of senior officers from multiple species who now hung on every word of her analysis. She remained characteristically modest about her achievements, but her quiet confidence reflected the knowledge that she had not only proven human worth among the stars but had fundamentally changed how galactic civilization approached complex scientific challenges. Commander Veltar's crystal body flashed respectful blue patterns as he introduced Katie to the new mapping team and described how her innovations had revolutionized their understanding of dangerous space regions. DR Nexus had reconfigured her holographic displays to incorporate Katie's four-dimensional navigation models. Chitrix had expanded her pattern recognition databases to include Earth-based analogies that might apply to future mapping challenges. The Stellar Horizon departed for its next mission, equipped with both advanced alien technology and human ingenuity, working together to explore regions of space that neither could have tackled alone. Katie's weather system approach had become the foundation for a new era of collaborative exploration that valued diverse perspectives as much as technological sophistication. The final image showed Katie standing at the center of the navigation lab, surrounded by alien colleagues who now sought her insights rather than dismissing her contributions. She had transformed from an overlooked junior officer into an essential leader, whose quiet competence and innovative thinking had opened new